Picture this. You're a detective walking into what you think is a routine welfare check in a rundown house in Queensland, Australia. You open a bedroom cupboard looking for evidence of drug possession, and instead you find a 19-year-old woman crammed inside, a woman the entire country believes has been dead for 5 years, a woman whose alleged murderer is literally on trial for her death at that very moment, 300 kilometers away.
Tony, in 23 years of forensic psychology, I've never encountered a case quite like Natasha Ryan's. The psychological complexity of what she accomplished and endured challenges everything we think we know about adolescent behavior and survival instincts.
Dr. Sarah Mitchell, thank you for joining us tonight. For our listeners who might not be familiar with this extraordinary case, we're talking about April 10, 2003, when police in Rockhampton discovered that 14-year-old Natasha Ryan, missing for 5 years, presumed murdered, was alive and hiding in a cupboard with her boyfriend.
What makes this case so fascinating from a psychological standpoint is that Natasha wasn't kidnapped, wasn't held against her will. She chose this life of complete isolation. She orchestrated her own disappearance and then sustained it for 5 years while living in spaces barely large enough for one person.
Let's set the scene. April 31st, 1998. It's a sweltering night in Rockhampton, a mining town where the red dust gets into everything and the heat is oppressive even after dark. 14-year-old Natasha Ryan goes to bed in her family home, and by morning she's vanished without a trace. Her mother, Rochelle, wakes up to find an empty bedroom and no sign of her daughter anywhere.
The initial disappearance actually follows a pattern we see in runaway cases. There had been family tensions, typical teenage conflicts with authority. But what's unprecedented is the duration and completeness of her concealment. Most runaway teens surface within days or weeks. Natasha managed to stay hidden for 5 years.
And during those 5 years, her case became connected to one of Australia's most notorious serial killers. Leonard John Fraser, known as the Rockhampton Rapist, confessed to murdering Natasha along with several other young women in the area.
This is where the case becomes truly remarkable. While Fraser was in custody confessing to her murder, while her family was grieving, while police were building a case against her alleged killer, Natasha was living less than 10 kilometers away from her family home.
The police believed Fraser. The prosecutors believed Fraser. He led them to burial sites. He knew details about the area. How does a serial killer's confession become so central to a case when the victim is actually alive?
Fraser had already been connected to multiple murders in the region. His confessions contained enough accurate details about other crimes that investigators had no reason to doubt his claims about Natasha. From an investigative standpoint, it made perfect sense. A vulnerable teenage girl, a predator operating in the same area, a confession that fit the pattern.
Meanwhile, Natasha is surviving in conditions that sound almost impossible. We're talking about hiding in cupboards, under beds, in crawl spaces, for 5 years. How does the human psyche adapt to that level of confinement and isolation?
What Natasha endured would be considered severe psychological torture in any other context. Complete social isolation, confined spaces, the constant fear of discovery. Yet she not only survived it, she chose it over returning to her previous life. That tells us something profound about what she was running from.
And then comes April 10th, 2003. Police arrive at 29 Leroyd Street for what they think is a routine drug search. They're looking for Scott Black, Natasha's boyfriend, on minor possession charges. Instead, they discover the case that will turn Australian criminal justice upside down.
Imagine being the officer who opened that cupboard door. You're expecting to find drugs, maybe stolen property. Instead, you're face to face with Australia's most famous missing person, a girl whose murder trial is literally happening in Brisbane as you're standing there.
The timing is almost unbelievable. Fraser's trial for Natasha's murder was in its final stages. The prosecution was building their case around his confession, and at that exact moment, 300 kilometers away, police are discovering that their murder victim is very much alive.
The psychological impact on everyone involved cannot be overstated. Natasha's family had spent 5 years grieving her death. Her mother, Rochelle, had built her entire life around being the mother of a murdered child. Suddenly, that grief, that identity, that entire reality gets shattered in a single moment.
Tonight, we're going to explore how a 14-year-old girl managed to disappear so completely that she became a ghost in her own hometown. We'll examine the psychological mechanisms that allowed her to choose 5 years of hiding over facing whatever drove her to run in the first place.
This case forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about what we consider normal family dynamics, about how we define survival, and about the lengths a human being will go to in order to maintain control over their own existence.
Welcome to 5 Years in the Shadows, the Natasha Ryan story. To understand how Natasha could vanish so completely, we need to go back to Rockhampton in 1998. Dr. Mitchell, paint us a picture of what life was like for a 14-year-old girl in this mining town.
Rockhampton in the late 90s was a working-class community built around the cattle industry and mining. It's isolated. You're looking at over 600 kilometers to Brisbane, surrounded by red dirt and scrubland. For teenagers, especially, it could feel incredibly claustrophobic.
The Ryan family lived on Scott Street in a modest home. Natasha was the middle child. She had an older sister and younger brother. From the outside, they appeared to be a typical Australian family dealing with typical teenage issues.
But we have to remember that what appears normal from the outside can be vastly different from the lived experience inside a household. Natasha was dealing with the usual adolescent struggles, identity formation, pushing boundaries, conflicts with parental authority, but something in her environment made hiding in a cupboard for 5 years seem like a viable alternative.
Walk us through what we know about Natasha's life in those months leading up to her disappearance. She was attending North Rockhampton High School, had friends, seemed to be navigating the social dynamics that every teenager faces.
She was academically capable but not exceptional, socially connected but not part of the popular crowd. What stands out in retrospective interviews with her classmates is that she was described as someone who kept her deeper thoughts to herself. She wasn't the type to dramatically announce her problems.
And then there's Scott Black. He was 18 when Natasha was 14, a relationship that would raise immediate red flags today. How did this dynamic factor into her decision to disappear?
The age gap is significant, especially when you consider the developmental differences between a 14-year-old and an 18-year-old. Scott represented something outside her family structure, outside the normal boundaries of her teenage world, whether that was freedom, protection, or simply an alternative to whatever she was experiencing at home.
The night before she disappeared, August 31st, 1998, was there anything that stood out as unusual, any indication that this 14-year-old girl was about to execute one of the most elaborate disappearances in Australian history?
According to her family, it was an ordinary evening. Dinner, television, normal family interactions. Natasha went to bed around her usual time. Her mother, Rochelle, checked on her before going to sleep herself. Nothing suggested that within hours this teenager would walk out of her life and not resurface for 5 years.
But she had to have been planning this, right? You don't sustain a 5-year disappearance without some level of premeditation.
Absolutely. The logistics alone, where to hide, how to avoid detection, how to survive without any official identity or income, require planning. But what's fascinating is how a 14-year-old developed the psychological capacity for such long-term strategic thinking under what must have been considerable emotional stress.
Let's talk about Rockhampton itself as a character in this story. This isn't a major metropolitan area where someone could easily blend into anonymity. This is a town where people know each other, where a missing teenager becomes front-page news.
Exactly. Rockhampton had a population of around 60,000 at the time. It's the kind of community where your high school teachers might know your parents, where you run into neighbors at the grocery store. For Natasha to remain hidden, she had to become invisible in a place where invisibility should have been impossible.
And we can't discuss the context without addressing what else was happening in Rockhampton during this period. This wasn't just any missing person case. It was occurring in the same area where Leonard Fraser was actively hunting young women.
The timing is crucial to understanding both the investigation and the psychology involved. Fraser's attacks on young women in the region created an atmosphere of fear and heightened awareness of dangers to teenage girls. When Natasha disappeared, that context immediately shaped how authorities in the community interpreted her absence.
So when Rochelle Ryan woke up on September 1st, 1998, to find Natasha's bed empty, she wasn't just dealing with a missing teenager. She was confronting every parent's worst nightmare in a town where that nightmare had already become reality for other families.
The immediate assumption was abduction or worse. In that environment, with Fraser's crimes creating a climate of terror, no one was looking for an elaborate voluntary disappearance. Everyone was looking for a predator and a victim.
Which brings us to a crucial psychological question. What drives a 14-year-old to choose 5 years of hiding over whatever she was facing in her normal life? What was Natasha running from that made a cupboard seem like sanctuary?
That's the question that haunts this entire case, Tony. And it's one we'll need to explore carefully as we dig deeper into what really happened during those 5 years in the shadows.
Before we dive into those 5 years of hiding, we need to understand who Natasha Ryan really was, not the missing person on posters or the headlines, but the actual 14-year-old girl who made this impossible choice. Dr. Mitchell, what do we know about Natasha as a person?
This is where the case becomes heartbreaking, Tony. Natasha wasn't a troubled kid in the traditional sense. She was described by teachers as quiet but engaged, by friends as loyal and thoughtful. She loved animals, particularly horses, which is significant in a cattle town like Rockhampton, where that connection to animals represented something pure and uncomplicated.
Her family relationships paint a complex picture, don't they? Tell us about Rochelle Ryan, Natasha's mother, and the household dynamics.
Rochelle was a single mother working multiple jobs to support her 3 children. She was doing her best in difficult circumstances, but there's no question that stress levels in the household were high. Natasha's father wasn't consistently present, which meant Rochelle was essentially parenting alone while trying to maintain financial stability.
What about Natasha's siblings? How did they factor into her world?
She had an older sister, Amanda, who was already navigating her own path toward adulthood, and a younger brother who required significant attention. Natasha was in that difficult middle position, not old enough for the independence she craved, but not young enough to receive the focused care that her brother needed.
Friends from school describe her as someone who was well-liked, but not necessarily the center of attention. What does that tell us about her personality?
Natasha was an observer, Tony. She watched how people interacted, how families functioned, how the social dynamics of her school and community played out. This observational skill would later become crucial to her survival, understanding how to read people, how to anticipate behavior, how to remain unseen.
Let's talk about her relationship with Scott Black in more detail. How did a 14-year-old girl and an 18-year-old young man even meet in Rockhampton?
Small-town dynamics make these connections inevitable. Scott had dropped out of school, was working odd jobs, part of that group of young adults who hadn't quite found their direction yet. Natasha represented something different for him, someone who saw potential in him that others might not have recognized.
But from Natasha's perspective, what did Scott represent? What was she seeking in that relationship?
Freedom from surveillance, Tony. In her family home, every decision was scrutinized, every choice had to be justified. With Scott, she could make decisions about her own life without constant oversight. He represented autonomy, the chance to be seen as mature rather than as a child who needed protection.
Her teachers noticed changes in her behavior in the months before her disappearance. What were those warning signs that everyone missed?
Natasha became more secretive about her after-school activities, less communicative about her friendships. Her grades didn't drop dramatically, but her engagement in classroom discussions decreased. She was withdrawing gradually, testing how much of her life she could keep private.
What about her dreams and aspirations? What did 14-year-old Natasha want her future to look like?
This is particularly tragic. Natasha talked about working with animals, possibly becoming a veterinarian. She had sketches of horses in her school notebooks, spent hours reading about animal behavior. She was drawn to relationships where trust was simple and unconditional, very different from the complex family dynamics she was navigating.
When we look at her possessions, what she chose to leave behind when she disappeared, what does that tell us about her state of mind?
She left everything that connected her to her official identity: school books, family photos, even a diary that investigators later found. It's as if she was consciously shedding her previous self, choosing to become someone entirely new rather than trying to fix the problems in her existing life.
Her disappearance devastated not just her immediate family, but her extended network. How did her friends react when she vanished?
They were confused and heartbroken. Several of her classmates reported feeling guilty, wondering if they'd missed signs that she was struggling. There's a particular cruelty in how her friends had to watch her family grieve while they themselves lost someone who'd been an important part of their daily lives.
Rochelle Ryan's grief became very public during those 5 years. How did losing Natasha change her mother's life?
Rochelle became consumed with finding answers. She gave interview after interview, participated in search efforts, worked with police investigators. Her identity shifted from being Natasha's mother to being the mother of a missing child, and later, the mother of a murder victim. Her life revolved entirely around Natasha's absence.
What's particularly haunting is that while her family was grieving, while her friends were struggling with guilt and loss, while her community was living in fear, Natasha was experiencing her own form of suffering in those hidden spaces.
Exactly, Tony. This case forces us to recognize that there were multiple victims here, not just Natasha herself, but everyone who loved her and had to live with the devastating uncertainty of her disappearance.
Now we need to reconstruct September 1st, 1998, the day that changed everything. Dr. Mitchell, let's start from the beginning. What time did Rochelle Ryan discover that Natasha was missing?
According to police reports, Rochelle went to wake Natasha for school around 7:15 a.m. She knocked on the bedroom door, got no response, and when she opened it, the bed was empty. But here's what's crucial. The bed had been slept in. Natasha hadn't just run away in the middle of the night.
So she woke up, made a conscious decision, and then executed her disappearance. What was Rochelle's immediate reaction?
Initially, she wasn't panicked. Teenagers oversleep. Sometimes they sneak out early to meet friends. She checked the bathroom, the kitchen, even walked around the neighborhood thinking maybe Natasha had gone for a walk. It wasn't until about 8:30 a.m. that real concern set in.
At what point did she contact the school?
Around 9:15 a.m., Rochelle called North Rockhampton High School to see if Natasha had somehow made it there on her own. When the school confirmed she wasn't in her first period class and hadn't been marked present at all, that's when Rochelle realized this wasn't a simple case of teenage rebellion.
Who was the first person she called after the school?
Her sister, Amanda's aunt. Rochelle needed someone to help search and to stay with her younger son while she dealt with the crisis. By 10 a.m., they were calling Natasha's friends, asking if anyone had seen her or if she'd mentioned any plans.
What were those conversations like? How did Natasha's friends respond when they learned she was missing?
They were genuinely surprised, Tony. Her best friend Sarah told police that Natasha had seemed normal the previous day at school, had talked about a history assignment that was due later that week. There was no indication she was planning anything dramatic.
When did someone first mention Scott Black's name?
That came up around 11:30 a.m. One of Natasha's classmates mentioned that she had been spending time with an older boy, though they didn't know much about him. Rochelle knew about Scott, but hadn't realized how serious the relationship had become.
So by noon, roughly 5 hours after discovering Natasha missing, what actions had been taken?
Rochelle had contacted the school, called all of Natasha's known friends, driven around the immediate neighborhood, and started gathering information about Scott Black. She was also trying to decide when to involve police, hoping this would resolve itself before it became official.
At what point did she make that call to authorities?
1:45 p.m. Rochelle finally contacted Rockhampton police. She'd spent over 6 hours hoping Natasha would just come home, but the reality was setting in that this was beyond normal teenage behavior.
How did the police initially respond? What was their first assessment?
The responding officer, Constable Davies, took a missing person report, but followed standard protocol for runaway teenagers. In 1998, police typically waited longer before launching major search efforts unless there was evidence of foul play. They advised Rochelle to keep checking with friends and to call back if Natasha didn't return by evening.
Meanwhile, where was Natasha during these crucial first hours? Was she already in hiding, or was she still making arrangements?
Based on what we learned later, she was likely with Scott Black, finalizing the logistics of her disappearance. They would have needed time to prepare whatever hiding place they'd arranged, to gather basic supplies, to coordinate how this was going to work long-term.
By evening, let's say 6 p.m., how had the situation evolved?
The search had expanded. Neighbors were walking through yards calling Natasha's name. Friends were checking places where teenagers typically gathered. Rochelle was becoming increasingly frantic, calling the police station every hour for updates.
What was happening in the broader Rockhampton community? How quickly did news of another missing teenage girl spread?
Very quickly, and with tremendous fear. Remember, Leonard Fraser had been attacking young women in the area. When word got out that another teenage girl had vanished, the community immediately assumed the worst. Parents were calling their daughters home, imposing curfews, cancelling social plans.
By nightfall on September 1st, roughly 12 hours after her disappearance, what was the official status of the investigation?
Police had upgraded it from a routine runaway case to an active missing person investigation. They'd begun interviewing Natasha's friends more formally, had located and questioned Scott Black briefly, and were preparing to organize search teams if she didn't surface overnight.
And Scott's initial response to police questioning?
He claimed he hadn't seen Natasha since the previous weekend, said he knew nothing about her disappearance, and actually seemed genuinely concerned for her safety. Police found his reaction credible at the time. He appeared worried rather than evasive.
So as September 1st ended, as Rochelle Ryan faced her first night not knowing where her daughter was, what was everyone expecting to happen next?
Most people believed Natasha would come home within 24 to 48 hours, hungry and apologetic. No one, not her family, not the police, not the community, imagined they were beginning a 5-year ordeal that would redefine everything they thought they knew about missing persons cases.
Chapter 5. The Discovery. Dr. Mitchell, when September 2nd dawned and Natasha still hadn't returned home, how did that change the entire dynamic of the investigation?
Everything shifted, Tony. What had been treated as a probable runaway case suddenly became a potential abduction, or worse. The 24-hour mark is crucial in missing person investigations. It's when hope starts transforming into genuine fear.
Walk us through how that second day unfolded. What was Rochelle Ryan's state of mind?
Rochelle had barely slept. She'd been calling Natasha's friends throughout the night, checking and rechecking every place her daughter might go. By morning, she was operating on pure adrenaline and maternal desperation. She contacted police again at 6:30 a.m., demanding more aggressive action.
How did the police response change on day 2?
Detective Senior Constable Paul Watts was assigned as the lead investigator. This wasn't a patrol officer taking a routine report anymore. This was a detective with experience in serious missing person cases. The first thing he did was expand the questioning of Scott Black.
Tell us about that second interview with Scott. How did his demeanor change when he realized he was now dealing with detectives rather than patrol officers?
This is where things get psychologically fascinating, Tony. Scott maintained his story but showed signs of stress, fidgeting, asking repeatedly if he needed a lawyer, claiming he was being unfairly targeted because of his age and his relationship with Natasha. Yet, he still appeared genuinely concerned about her safety.
Meanwhile, the organized search efforts were beginning. What did those look like in a town like Rockhampton?
By September 3rd, they had over 200 volunteers combing through bushland, checking abandoned buildings, searching along the Fitzroy River. The SES, State Emergency Service, brought in search dogs. Local businesses closed early so employees could join the effort. The entire community was mobilized.
What's particularly chilling is that during these searches, Natasha was likely watching from her hiding place, seeing her family and neighbors desperately looking for her. How do we process that psychological reality?
It's almost incomprehensible, Tony. Imagine being 14 years old, watching your mother on television pleading for your safe return, seeing hundreds of people searching for you, and choosing to remain hidden. The level of emotional compartmentalization required suggests either tremendous trauma or an extraordinary fear of what returning home might mean.
The media attention escalated quickly. When did this transition from a local missing person case to a national news story?
By September 4th, Channel 9's A Current Affair had picked up the story. The combination of factors, a photogenic teenage girl, a predator already operating in the area, and a family's visible anguish, made it compelling television. Natasha's school photo was being broadcast across Australia.
How did this media coverage affect the investigation itself?
It was a double-edged sword. The publicity generated hundreds of tips, but most were false leads that required detective hours to investigate. More importantly, it put enormous pressure on police to produce results quickly. Detective Watts later said he felt like the entire state was watching his every move.
What was the most promising lead that emerged during those first critical days?
A service station attendant reported seeing a girl matching Natasha's description getting into a car with an older man around 8 p.m. on September 1st. This sighting was about 10 kilometers from her home, which suggested she hadn't simply wandered off on foot. Police spent weeks tracking down that lead.
Did that sighting turn out to be legitimate?
No. They eventually identified the girl. She was a hitchhiker from Queensland heading south, completely unconnected to Natasha's case. But for nearly 2 weeks, that false sighting drove the investigation in entirely the wrong direction, toward stranger abduction rather than voluntary disappearance.
Meanwhile, what was happening with the Fraser investigation? How did those two cases begin to intersect?
This is crucial, Tony. Leonard Fraser became a person of interest in Natasha's disappearance almost immediately. He fit the profile of someone who might target teenage girls, and his known activities in the Rockhampton area made him a logical suspect. Detectives began building a timeline to see if Fraser could be connected to September 1st.
So while the real Natasha was hiding with Scott Black, police resources were being focused on a serial killer. How did that misdirection shape everything that followed?
It meant that for years, everyone was looking for a dead girl rather than a living one. Search efforts focused on body recovery rather than finding hiding places. The investigation assumed violence rather than considering the possibility of an elaborate voluntary disappearance.
By the end of the first week, what was the official status of Natasha Ryan's case?
She was presumed dead, Tony. While police publicly maintained hope, privately they were operating under the assumption that they were dealing with a homicide. The search shifted from rescue to recovery, and Leonard Fraser had become their primary suspect.
Which means that from the very beginning, everyone was asking the wrong questions about Natasha Ryan's disappearance.
Exactly, and that fundamental misunderstanding would shape the next 5 years of investigation, prosecution, and heartbreak for everyone involved.
Now we need to examine the physical evidence, or rather, the complete absence of it. Dr. Mitchell, when investigators finally gained access to search Natasha's bedroom thoroughly, what did the crime scene tell them?
Tony, calling it a crime scene is exactly the problem investigators faced. Natasha's bedroom looked like a teenager had simply gotten up and left for school. The bed was made, hastily but made. Her school uniform from the previous day was in the laundry hamper. Her backpack was gone, but that seemed normal since she should have been heading to class.
What about signs of struggle? Any indication that someone had taken her against her will?
Absolutely none. The window was locked from the inside. There were no scuff marks on the walls, no overturned furniture, no signs that anyone else had been in that room. Her diary was still there, sitting openly on her desk. If someone had abducted her, they would have taken her straight from her bedroom, which was physically impossible given the evidence.
Tell us about that diary. What did investigators find when they read through it?
This is where the case gets complicated, Tony. The diary entries from the weeks leading up to her disappearance showed a girl struggling with family restrictions, feeling misunderstood, writing about wanting freedom to make my own choices. But there was nothing about planning to disappear, nothing about Scott Black beyond typical teenage romance entries.
What about her clothing? What was missing from her wardrobe?
Her mother, Rochelle, noticed that some casual clothes were gone. Jeans, a few t-shirts, her favorite jacket. But not enough for someone planning to be away permanently. It looked more like she'd packed for a weekend away, not a years-long disappearance.
The backpack that was missing, did investigators ever determine what she might have taken with her?
Based on what wasn't in her room, police theorized she had taken some basic school supplies, maybe $50 in cash from her savings, and personal items like photographs. Again, nothing suggested long-term planning. It appeared she'd grabbed whatever she could carry in a standard school backpack.
What about physical evidence outside the house? Any footprints, tire tracks, signs of how she actually left the property?
This was one of the most puzzling aspects, Tony. The Ryan house had a gravel driveway and soft soil around the gardens. There were Natasha's footprints leading from the back door toward the street, but then they simply disappeared at the sidewalk. No indication of a vehicle, no signs of where she went next.
How did investigators interpret those footprints? What did they suggest about her departure?
The prints indicated she'd walked calmly, at a normal pace, carrying something heavy, presumably her backpack. There were no drag marks, no signs she'd been forced. She appeared to have walked voluntarily to meet someone or something at the street level.
When police processed her bedroom for fingerprints and other trace evidence, what did they discover?
Only prints belonging to family members and a few of Natasha's close friends who'd been in her room recently for sleepovers. Most significantly, there were no unidentified male prints, no evidence that Scott Black or any other man had been in her bedroom recently.
What about her personal communications? Did she have access to a mobile phone, email, any way of coordinating her disappearance electronically?
Remember, this was 1998, Tony. Natasha didn't have a mobile phone. Most 14-year-olds didn't back then. The family had dial-up internet, but investigators found no relevant emails or chat room conversations on their computer. Any coordination would have had to happen face-to-face or through landline phone calls.
Speaking of phone records, what did those reveal about the days leading up to her disappearance?
The Ryan family's phone records showed normal usage patterns. Calls to Natasha's school friends, pizza deliveries, Rochelle calling relatives. There were no unusual outgoing calls and no suspicious incoming calls in the 72 hours before September 1st.
What about the broader neighborhood? Did any neighbors report seeing anything unusual that morning?
This is what made the case so mystifying. Mrs. Henderson, who lived across the street, was watering her garden around 7 a.m. and saw nothing unusual. The school bus driver confirmed Natasha wasn't at her usual stop. It was as if she'd simply vanished between her bedroom and the street.
Were there any security cameras in the area that might have captured her leaving?
In 1998, residential security cameras were rare, especially in middle-class neighborhoods like the Ryans. The nearest camera was at a service station about 2 kilometers away, and reviewing that footage showed nothing relevant to Natasha's movements.
What did the absence of physical evidence tell investigators about what they were dealing with?
It created a logical contradiction that haunted the case for years, Tony. The evidence suggested voluntary departure, but the investigators couldn't accept that a 14-year-old girl would willingly disappear so completely. They kept looking for signs of abduction that simply weren't there.
So the crime scene itself was telling a story that no one wanted to believe.
Exactly. The physical evidence was screaming runaway, but everyone involved, family, police, media, was convinced they were dealing with something much more sinister.
Chapter 7. Initial Investigation. Dr. Mitchell, this contradiction between physical evidence and investigative instinct, How did it shape the direction of the initial investigation?
It created what I call confirmation bias in reverse, Tony. Instead of accepting what the evidence was telling them, investigators began looking for hidden clues that would support the abduction theory. They were convinced they were missing something crucial.
Walk us through Detective Watt's first 48 hours as lead investigator. What was his immediate priority?
Watts focused on 3 areas: expanding the Scott Black interviews, organizing systematic neighborhood canvassing, and coordinating with the Fraser investigation team. He was essentially running 2 parallel investigations, one assuming Natasha was dead, another assuming she was alive but hidden.
Let's talk about those expanded Scott Black interviews. How did his story hold up under more intensive questioning?
Remarkably well, actually. Scott provided detailed accounts of his whereabouts on September 1st. He claimed he was helping his father with yard work until noon, then spent the afternoon at a friend's house playing video games. Police verified these alibis and found them solid.
But something about Scott's demeanor was bothering investigators, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Detective Watts noted in his reports that Scott seemed overly helpful and surprisingly calm for a boyfriend whose girlfriend had vanished. Most teenagers in that situation would be emotional, demanding to join search efforts. Scott remained almost detached.
Meanwhile, how were police handling the Leonard Fraser angle? What made him such a compelling suspect?
Fraser's pattern was well established by September 1998. He targeted young women, often approached them near schools or public transport, and had been escalating his violence. The timing of Natasha's disappearance, just months after his attack on the 17-year-old, seemed too coincidental.
What specific evidence initially linked Fraser to Natasha's case?
Mostly circumstantial connections. Tony Fraser had been spotted in Natasha's neighborhood several times in the weeks before her disappearance. He knew the area around her school, and his modus operandi, approaching young women with offers of rides or assistance, could explain how Natasha might have left the house willingly but then been taken against her will.
How did investigators reconcile Fraser's violent history with the complete absence of violence in Natasha's bedroom?
They theorized that Fraser had approached Natasha outside her house, perhaps as she was leaving for school. Maybe he offered her a ride, claimed there was an emergency involving her family, or used some other ruse to get her into his vehicle voluntarily.
By the end of the first week, what investigative resources were being devoted to the Fraser connection versus other possibilities?
Roughly 70% of detective hours were focused on Fraser, Tony. They were building a timeline of his movements, re-interviewing his known associates, and trying to find any physical evidence connecting him to September 1st. The Scott Black angle was receiving maybe 20% of their attention, with the remaining 10% on other theories.
What other theories were investigators considering at this point?
There was brief consideration of stranger abduction by someone other than Fraser, the possibility that she'd been groomed by an online predator, though internet predation was less common in 1998, and even a theory that she'd been taken by someone she knew from school or the neighborhood.
How were Rochelle Ryan and the family handling this initial investigative period?
Rochelle was becoming increasingly frustrated with what she saw as scattered police efforts. She wanted them to focus entirely on finding Natasha alive, while police were clearly preparing for the worst-case scenario. The family was also dealing with intense media scrutiny and well-meaning but overwhelming community support.
What was the most significant investigative mistake made during these early days?
The decision to treat Scott Black as a cooperative witness rather than a potential suspect, Tony. Because his alibis checked out and his demeanor seemed credible, investigators didn't push hard enough on his relationship with Natasha or explore the possibility that he might be actively helping her hide.
By September 10th, 9 days after the disappearance, what was the official investigative consensus?
Police were operating under the assumption that Natasha Ryan was dead, most likely killed by Leonard Fraser. They'd shifted from rescue operations to what was essentially a homicide investigation. Search efforts were now focused on body recovery rather than finding a living person.
How did this consensus affect the investigation's trajectory over the following weeks?
It created a tunnel vision that would persist for years, Tony. Once investigators committed to the Fraser theory, every piece of evidence was interpreted through that lens. They stopped looking for signs that Natasha might be alive and started building a murder case against Fraser.
So within 10 days, the investigation had fundamentally misunderstood what had actually happened to Natasha Ryan.
Completely. While police were preparing to charge Leonard Fraser with her murder, Natasha was alive and hiding less than 5 kilometers from her family home, probably watching news reports about her own disappearance and wondering if she could ever safely return.
Chapter 8. Witness Testimonies. Dr. Mitchell, as police built their case around the Fraser theory, they began collecting witness statements. What were the most significant testimonies that emerged during those early weeks?
The witness accounts paint a fascinating picture of misdirection, Tony. The most compelling testimony came from Margaret Collins, a school crossing guard who claimed she saw Natasha talking to an older man near the school grounds on August 30th, just 2 days before her disappearance.
Tell us more about Margaret Collins's account. What exactly did she observe?
Collins said she noticed a girl matching Natasha's description, having what appeared to be an intense conversation with a man in his 40s near the school fence around 3:30 p.m. She remembered it because the girl seemed upset, and the man kept looking around nervously, as if he didn't want to be seen.
Did Collins' description of this man match Leonard Fraser's appearance?
Loosely, yes. She described him as average height, stocky build, wearing work clothes. Fraser fit that general profile, and investigators became convinced this was the smoking gun that connected him to Natasha. Collins was asked to view a photo lineup and tentatively identified Fraser.
How reliable was Collins as a witness? What was her background?
Margaret Collins was 67 years old, had been a crossing guard for 15 years, and was considered very observant by both school staff and police. She had excellent vision, took her job seriously, and had previously provided accurate witness testimony in a minor traffic accident case. She seemed like the ideal witness.
But there was a problem with her testimony, wasn't there?
A massive problem that didn't emerge until much later, Tony. Margaret Collins had never actually seen Natasha Ryan in person before her disappearance. She was identifying a girl she'd only seen in newspaper photos after the fact. Her entire testimony was based on recognizing someone from media coverage, not from personal knowledge.
What other significant witness testimony emerged during this period?
David Chen, who operated a convenience store about halfway between Natasha's house and school, reported seeing a teenage girl matching her description on the morning of September 1st around 7:45 a.m. His account was crucial because it suggested Natasha had left her house and was heading towards school normally.
What specifically did Chen observe?
Chen said a girl in a school uniform walked past his store, carrying a backpack and appearing to be in no distress. She was walking at a normal pace, not running or looking over her shoulder. He remembered thinking she was running slightly late for school because most students passed by earlier.
Did Chen's timeline align with what investigators knew about Natasha's normal routine?
It fit perfectly, Tony. If Natasha had left her house around 7:35 a.m., as her mother believed, she would have passed Chen's store right around 7:45. This testimony seemed to confirm that she had started her journey to school normally, before something went wrong.
How certain was Chen about his identification?
Initially, very certain. He told police he'd served Natasha several times before when she bought snacks after school, and he was confident about recognizing her. But Chen's testimony had the same fundamental problem as Collins. He was making his identification after weeks of seeing Natasha's photo in media coverage.
Were there any witnesses who claimed to see Natasha later that morning after the Chen sighting?
Yes, and this is where the witness accounts become problematic. Patricia Williams, a bus driver on a route that ran near the school, reported seeing a girl matching Natasha's description getting into a dark-colored sedan around 8:15 a.m., about 6 blocks from the school.
That would place Natasha much closer to school, but still not at the campus itself. What did Williams observe about this interaction?
Williams said the girl approached the car willingly, suggesting she knew the driver. The car was stopped at a red light, the passenger door opened, and the girl got in without any apparent hesitation or struggle. Williams assumed it was a parent giving their child a ride to school.
Did Williams get a clear look at the driver or the vehicle?
Unfortunately, no. She was concentrating on traffic and only glanced at the interaction. She described the driver as male, but couldn't provide age, height, or facial features. The car was dark-colored, either black, navy blue, or dark green, but she couldn't identify the make or model.
How did investigators weigh these various witness accounts against each other?
They tried to create a timeline showing Natasha's movement from home towards school, then getting picked up by an unknown man who they assumed was Fraser. It seemed to tell a coherent story of a planned abduction disguised as offering assistance.
But looking back now, knowing what we know about Scott Black's involvement, how should these witness testimonies be interpreted?
It's likely that none of these witnesses actually saw Natasha Ryan on September 1st, Tony. They were all making identifications weeks after her disappearance, influenced by extensive media coverage. The real Natasha was probably already hiding with Scott Black by the time these alleged sightings occurred.
So the witness testimony that seemed to support the abduction theory was fundamentally flawed from the beginning.
Exactly. Well-meaning people were unconsciously creating false memories based on what they'd seen in newspapers and television reports. The investigation was being driven by testimony that simply wasn't reliable.
Chapter 9. Forensic Evidence. Dr. Mitchell, while investigators were building their case on witness testimony that we now know was unreliable, what physical evidence was the forensics team actually finding?
This is where the case becomes truly fascinating from a scientific perspective, Tony. The forensic evidence consistently contradicted the investigative theory, but it took years for anyone to properly interpret what the physical clues were actually saying.
Let's start with Natasha's bedroom. What did forensic analysis reveal about her last night at home?
The bedroom told a very specific story. Fingerprint powder revealed that Natasha had handled items throughout her room in a deliberate pattern. She'd opened dresser drawers, touched picture frames, even handled books on her shelf. This wasn't someone being abducted suddenly. This was someone saying goodbye.
What about fiber analysis? Did that reveal anything about who might have been in her room?
Here's what's crucial, Tony. The only textile fibers found in Natasha's bedroom came from family members' clothing and her own garments. No foreign fibers, no fabric transfer from an abductor's clothing. But there was something unusual, synthetic fibers on her windowsill that didn't match any clothing in the house.
Those synthetic fibers, what did analysis determine about their origin?
The lab identified them as polyester blend material, consistent with inexpensive men's clothing, work shirts or casual wear. The fibers were fresh, deposited within 24 hours of collection. Someone had definitely been at her bedroom window recently.
How did investigators interpret these window fibers at the time?
They assumed it proved their abduction theory, Tony. They theorized that Fraser or another intruder had been watching Natasha through her window, planning the attack. But they completely missed the obvious explanation. Someone was communicating with her from outside, helping coordinate her departure.
What about DNA evidence? This was 1998. DNA technology was advancing rapidly.
The DNA analysis was limited, but telling. They found Natasha's DNA throughout her bedroom, obviously, plus DNA from her mother and sister on various items. But on her windowsill, mixed with those synthetic fibers, they found male DNA that didn't match any family member.
Did that unknown male DNA match Leonard Fraser's profile?
No, it didn't. When Fraser was eventually arrested and his DNA was tested, it bore no similarity to the genetic material found at Natasha's window. This should have been a huge red flag, but investigators dismissed it as contamination or assumed it came from some innocent source.
What other forensic evidence emerged from processing the Ryan house?
The backpack disappearance was forensically significant, Tony. They found fabric impressions on Natasha's bedroom carpet, where her heavy school bag normally sat. The impressions were old, indicating the bag had been in that position for months. But they also found fresh scuff marks near the door, where something heavy had been dragged.
What did those scuff marks tell forensic experts?
The pattern suggested someone had packed that backpack very heavily. much heavier than normal school supplies, and had difficulty lifting it. The marks showed the bag being dragged several feet before being picked up. This indicated planning and preparation, not a sudden abduction.
Moving beyond the bedroom, what evidence did crime scene investigators find in the yard and surrounding area?
The soil analysis around the house was extremely revealing. They found multiple sets of male footprints near Natasha's bedroom window, not just from the night she disappeared, but from several previous occasions. The prints showed someone had been visiting that window regularly.
Could forensics determine anything about the person making those footprints?
The shoe impressions indicated a young male, probably teenage, wearing size 10 athletic shoes, specifically Nike brand sneakers that were popular in 1998. The depth and gait pattern suggested someone around 17 to 18 years old, not a middle-aged man like Fraser.
How did investigators reconcile this evidence with their Fraser theory?
They couldn't reconcile it, so they largely ignored it, Tony. When physical evidence contradicted their preferred narrative, they attributed it to contamination, coincidence, or irrelevance. This was forensic evidence being subordinated to investigative prejudice.
What about vehicle evidence? Did crime scene teams find any tire tracks or automotive evidence?
No vehicle evidence whatsoever near the Ryan house. The street was concrete, so tire impressions were unlikely, but there were no oil stains, no rubber transfer marks, no indication that any car had stopped near their property recently.
That absence of vehicle evidence, how significant was that scientifically?
Extremely significant. If Natasha had been abducted by someone like Fraser, there would have been some automotive evidence. Cars leave traces, especially when they're used in crimes. The complete absence suggested she hadn't left the area in a vehicle that night.
So the forensic evidence was painting a completely different picture than what investigators wanted to see.
Exactly, Tony. Every piece of physical evidence suggested a planned departure coordinated with someone she knew well, specifically a teenage male who had been visiting her regularly. The science was screaming that this wasn't an abduction, but nobody wanted to listen to what the evidence was actually saying.
So if the forensic evidence was pointing away from Fraser, when did investigators start seriously considering other suspects?
It took far too long, Tony. It wasn't until October 1998, more than a month after Natasha's disappearance, that detectives began expanding their suspect pool. The first new name to emerge was actually someone they'd already interviewed, Scott Black.
What prompted them to take a second look at Scott Black?
Detective Sarah Williams was reviewing all the witness statements when she noticed inconsistencies in Scott's timeline. He'd told investigators he was at work on September 1st, but when she called his employer to verify, they had no record of him being scheduled that day. He'd also claimed he barely knew Natasha, but school records showed they'd been assigned to several group projects together.
How did Scott Black respond when confronted with these discrepancies?
He became much less cooperative. In his second interview, he admitted he'd lied about working that day but claimed he'd just been embarrassed about being unemployed. He also acknowledged knowing Natasha better than he'd initially stated, saying he didn't want to get involved in a police investigation.
Were there other suspects emerging during this period?
Yes. Investigators identified 3 additional persons of interest. Marcus Thompson, a 23-year-old who lived 2 streets from the Ryans and had previous charges for stalking a teenage girl. Kevin Walsh, a school maintenance worker who'd been fired for inappropriate comments to female students. And surprisingly, David Chen, the convenience store owner who'd claimed to see Natasha that morning.
What made investigators suspicious of David Chen?
Detective Williams realized that Chen's description of seeing Natasha at 7:45 a.m. didn't match the school's attendance records. If Natasha had been walking toward school at that time, she would have arrived before 8 a.m. But the school had no record of her entering the building, signing in late, or being marked absent by first-period teachers.
So Chen's testimony wasn't just unreliable, it was potentially fabricated?
Exactly, Tony. When investigators pressed him on the timing, Chen became evasive. He started changing details about what Natasha was wearing and which direction she was walking. They began to wonder if he'd invented the sighting entirely, possibly to insert himself into the investigation for psychological reasons.
What about Marcus Thompson? What drew police attention to him?
Thompson had a very specific pattern of behavior. He would identify teenage girls in his neighborhood, learn their routines, then create opportunities to encounter them accidentally. In 1997, he'd been charged with following a 16-year-old girl home from school repeatedly and showing up at places where she spent time.
Did Thompson have any connection to Natasha Ryan specifically?
Police discovered he'd been asking neighbors questions about the Ryan family weeks before Natasha disappeared. He'd inquired about their work schedules, whether Natasha walked to school alone, and even asked one neighbor if Natasha had a boyfriend. This suggested pre-planning and surveillance.
How did investigators approach Thompson as a suspect?
Very carefully. They conducted surveillance first, watching his daily patterns and documenting his movements. What they found was disturbing. Thompson was still stalking teenage girls in the neighborhood, following them at a distance and photographing them with a telephoto lens from his car.
What was Kevin Walsh's background? Why did he emerge as a suspect?
Walsh had been fired from his school maintenance job in June 1998 after multiple female students complained he'd made sexually inappropriate comments. One girl reported he'd offered to drive her home, another said he'd asked personal questions about her family situation. The school hadn't reported these incidents to police at the time.
Did Walsh have access to information about students' schedules and routines?
Absolutely, Tony. As a maintenance worker, he had keys to most areas of the school, access to student records, and detailed knowledge of when different areas of the campus were occupied or empty. He also knew which students walked to school versus those who took buses or got rides.
How did the investigation team prioritize these multiple suspects?
By November 1998, they'd created a ranking system based on opportunity, motive, and behavioral patterns. Scott Black was ranked highest due to his lies and direct connection to Natasha. Thompson was second because of his stalking history and neighborhood surveillance. Fraser had actually dropped to third position, with Walsh and Chen ranked lower.
What investigative techniques were being used to evaluate these suspects?
Standard police procedure, surveillance, background checks, re-interviewing associates, and looking for physical evidence connecting any of them to September 1st. They also brought in a criminal psychologist to create behavioral profiles of each suspect and assess which personality type was most likely to be responsible.
So by late 1998, the investigation had evolved significantly from those early Fraser-focused weeks.
Completely transformed, Tony. What had started as a tunnel vision pursuit of Leonard Fraser had become a complex multi-suspect investigation. Unfortunately, they still hadn't grasped the fundamental truth that Natasha Ryan was alive and hiding voluntarily. They were investigating a murder that hadn't actually occurred.